Thunder rumbled as rain lashed the hospital windows. Inside the dimly lit ICU, Dr. Malcolm Reed stood over the unconscious patient, his hands steady but his jaw clenched. The monitor beeped erratically, the man's pulse weak. Across the room, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks whispered, "Please, Malcolm. He's my father. Save him." Malcolm's piercing gaze didn't waver as he tightened his grip on the scalpel. The man lying before him was James Whitman, a man who had cursed Malcolm's name, slammed the door in his face, and declared his daughter Eleanor dead to him on their wedding day. Now, James's life hung by a thread, and Malcolm was the only surgeon capable of performing the life-saving procedure. "I'll do my job," Malcolm said, his voice like steel, "but not because of who he is, because of who you are." Eleanor's sob caught in her throat. She reached out to touch Malcolm's arm, but he had already turned to focus on the task at hand. Before we dive deeper into this intense story, I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in this situation? Would you save someone who wronged you in the past? Or would you let them face the consequences of their actions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying the drama so far. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more intense stories like this. We've got plenty more twists and turns coming your way. James Whitman was the kind of man who commanded a room without uttering a word. With his tailored suits, silver-streaked hair, and piercing blue eyes, he exuded authority and respect. A self-made millionaire, James had risen from a modest upbringing in a working-class neighborhood to owning one of the most successful logistics companies in the country. His empire was a testament to his discipline and unyielding principles, traits he demanded not only from his employees, but also from his family. His mansion on the outskirts of the city was a symbol of his success, a sprawling estate complete with manicured gardens, marble floors, and walls adorned with portraits of past generations. James saw himself as the torchbearer of his family's legacy, a man responsible for upholding tradition and passing down values he believed were non-negotiable. Among these values was a deep, albeit unspoken, adherence to social boundaries. James took pride in what he considered the Whitman way, a life of hard work, dignity, and above all, maintaining appearances. These principles were ingrained in his only daughter Eleanor from an early age. He had groomed her to be a reflection of his ideals, intelligent, poised, and capable of carrying forward the Whitman name with pride. Eleanor had always been James's pride and joy. As a child, she had accompanied him to company events, charming his colleagues and earning praise for her wit and grace. James envisioned her future clearly. She would marry a man of equal status, someone who shared their values and could complement the family's legacy. What James couldn't see or refused to acknowledge was the rigidity of his worldview. Beneath his polished exterior lay a stubbornness that bordered on arrogance. To James, there were no gray areas, no room for deviation from the path he deemed appropriate. But Eleanor was no longer a child. As much as she loved her father, she had her own dreams and a mind of her own. What James saw as tradition, Eleanor saw as a cage. And when she met Malcolm Reed, her father's carefully constructed ideals would soon come crashing down. Eleanor Whitman wasn't looking for love when she first met Dr. Malcolm Reed. At 28, she was focused on her career as a public health advocate, driven by a passion to improve lives and make a difference. Volunteering at a medical conference had seemed like just another way to contribute to a cause she cared about. Little did she know that decision would change the course of her life forever. Malcolm, a rising star in cardiothoracic surgery, was the keynote speaker at the conference. Tall, with an easy smile and a voice that commanded attention, he spoke with a blend of confidence and humility that captivated the audience. He shared stories of patients whose lives had been transformed, not just by advanced medical techniques, but also by the power of compassion and care. Eleanor found herself lingering after his talk, drawn by his sincerity. When their paths crossed in the hallway, Malcolm noticed her immediately. She wasn't just beautiful, though her honey blonde hair and piercing green eyes turned heads, but there was an energy about her, a quiet determination that intrigued him. Their first conversation was effortless, flowing from the topics of medicine and public health to their shared belief in the importance of helping others. They discovered they had much in common, a love of jazz music, a penchant for late-night debates about philosophy, and a deep respect for their family's sacrifices. Malcolm asked her to dinner that evening, and Eleanor accepted, surprising even herself. She hadn't been on a date in over a year, too consumed by work to entertain romance. But there was something about Malcolm, his warmth, his intellect, his genuine interest in her, that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. Over the next few months, their relationship blossomed. They laughed, dreamed, and planned for a future together. But as much as Eleanor cherished the growing bond between them, a shadow loomed over her joy: her father. James Whitman's views on race were no secret, and as her feelings for Malcolm deepened, Eleanor knew she would soon face a choice that could alter her life and her family forever. Eleanor knew introducing Malcolm to her father would be challenging, but she had convinced herself that James Whitman, despite his flaws, loved her enough to set his prejudices aside. She spent days rehearsing the conversation in her mind, crafting arguments to counter his possible objections. Malcolm, ever supportive, assured her he was ready to face whatever came their way. The evening began with an air of strained civility. Eleanor had arranged the dinner in her father's grand dining room, the long mahogany table set with crystal glasses and fine china. Malcolm, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, extended his hand to James with a calm smile. "Mr. Whitman, it's an honor to meet you," Malcolm said, his tone respectful. James shook his hand briefly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Likewise," he replied, though the word lacked warmth. His sharp blue eyes scrutinized Malcolm, as if searching for a flaw to validate his disapproval. Eleanor tried to steer the conversation to neutral topics, but James's tone grew increasingly curt. He ignored Malcolm's attempts to engage and redirected every question back to Eleanor. It wasn't long before the tension in the room became unbearable. "So," James finally said, setting down his wine glass with a deliberate clang, "how did you two meet?" Eleanor explained their first encounter at the medical conference, her voice steady despite her father's cold demeanor. "And what exactly do you intend to do with my daughter, Dr. Reed?" James asked, his words laced with contempt. Malcolm remained composed. "With all due respect, sir, my intentions are to love and support Eleanor. I hope to build a future with her." The room fell silent, the weight of Malcolm's words hanging in the air. Then James leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "This future you're imagining," he said, his voice cold and cutting, "does not include my blessing. Eleanor, if you choose to marry this man, consider yourself disowned." Eleanor's heart shattered, but she met her father's glare with unwavering resolve. "Then so be it," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. As Malcolm reached for her hand, Eleanor stood. Together, they left the house, leaving James alone with his pride and the echoes of his own bitterness. Leaving her father's mansion that night felt like stepping into a void. Eleanor had spent her entire life tied to the Whitman legacy, bound by the expectations of her father's rigid world. Walking away meant abandoning not just her inheritance, but the life she had known. Yet, as Malcolm held her hand tightly, she felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Eleanor moved out of her childhood home and into a modest apartment she and Malcolm chose together. It wasn't lavish like the Whitman estate, but it was warm, filled with laughter and the promise of a shared future. She found herself thriving in ways she never had before, free from the constant pressure of her father's scrutiny. Eleanor's relationship with Malcolm deepened during this time. He became her rock, encouraging her as she grappled with the emotional weight of her decision. When she doubted herself, Malcolm reminded her of her bravery and the love they shared. They spent long nights planning their wedding and dreaming about the family they would one day build together. Professionally, Eleanor found solace in her work. With Malcolm's support, she launched a nonprofit focused on providing healthcare access to underserved communities. The initiative was close to both their hearts, and Eleanor poured her energy into it, finding purpose and fulfillment in helping others. Yet, despite her growing happiness, Eleanor couldn't completely escape the ache of estrangement from her father. She missed their Sunday breakfasts, the way he used to smile at her accomplishments, and the pride she once saw in his eyes. But every time she considered reaching out, she remembered the icy finality of his words. "Consider yourself disowned." Meanwhile, James Whitman immersed himself in work, pretending his life hadn't been upended. He avoided questions about Eleanor, dismissing any mention of her with a wave of his hand. But late at night, alone in his study, he stared at her childhood photos and felt a pang of something he refused to name. Neither father nor daughter realized it yet, but their paths were destined to cross again in a way neither could have foreseen. James Whitman's health had always been as robust as his ego. At 63, he prided himself on a rigorous fitness regimen and a clean bill of health during annual checkups, but no amount of discipline could prepare him for the silent storm brewing within him. It began subtly, a few skipped meals here, a persistent fatigue there. James ignored the warning signs, dismissing them as the inevitable wear and tear of aging. However, when the chest pain began, sharp and unrelenting, he could no longer brush it aside. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, James collapsed in his office. His assistant, Martha, found him slumped over his desk, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Panicked, she called for an ambulance, her trembling hands barely able to dial the number. James woke hours later in a sterile hospital room, the steady beep of monitors the only sound. A grim-faced doctor stood at his bedside, his clipboard clutched tightly. "Mr. Whitman, you've had a major cardiac event," the doctor explained. "We stabilized you for now, but your condition is critical. You need a coronary bypass as soon as possible." James listened in stunned silence. A bypass? The thought of being so vulnerable, relying on someone else to save his life, was almost unbearable. As the days passed, James's pride kept him from accepting the gravity of his situation. He insisted on reviewing his case himself, demanding the hospital's top surgeon. But the irony was cruel. The hospital's best cardiothoracic specialist was none other than Dr. Malcolm Reed, the man James had vowed never to accept into his family. When the hospital administrator informed him of this fact, James's face flushed with indignation. "Anyone but him," he growled. "Find someone else." But there was no one else, not with Malcolm's expertise and success rate. The administrator was firm. "Dr. Reed is your best option. Without him, your chances of survival drop significantly." Faced with the harsh truth, James realized he had no choice. Swallowing his pride, he nodded curtly. "Bring him in." As James waited for Malcolm to arrive, he couldn't help but wonder how this man, this stranger he had spurned, would greet him now. Malcolm Reed had spent years proving himself in the medical field, from his early days as a young, ambitious intern to his rise as one of the most respected surgeons in the country. He had built his reputation on expertise, precision, and compassion. But nothing could have prepared him for the emotional weight of walking into James Whitman's hospital room. When the call came, he was in the middle of a consultation at his clinic. The administrator's voice on the phone was terse but firm. "Dr. Reed, we have an emergency case. James Whitman, yes, that James Whitman, has requested you personally for a coronary bypass. The situation is critical. He's in room 312. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He didn't need to. His mind raced not with doubts about his skills, but with the knowledge of the personal history he shared with the man in that room. He hadn't spoken to James in nearly 2 years, since the night he had disowned his daughter. And now he was being called upon to save the man who had once been so dismissive of him. As he entered the sterile hospital room, his gaze immediately locked on James. The once imposing figure now appeared frail, vulnerable. His face was drawn, his usual sharp features softened by the pallor of illness. James looked up from the bed, his blue eyes cold and calculating, but there was no hiding the fear lurking behind them. "Dr. Reed," James said, his voice hoarse, as though he was struggling to maintain his composure. "I didn't expect you to be the one to save me." Malcolm nodded, though he felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Whitman. Nothing more, nothing less." James's gaze lingered, and for a fleeting moment, Malcolm saw something akin to regret flash in his eyes. But it was quickly masked by his usual arrogance. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," James muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need you to fix me." Malcolm's heart clenched, but he kept his composure. "We'll take care of that, Mr. Whitman. But you need to focus on getting better." As Malcolm prepared to perform the surgery, he couldn't shake the thought that this was more than just a medical procedure. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would force both men to confront their past. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning, and Malcolm barely slept the night before. He had prepared himself for countless surgeries in his career, but this felt different. This wasn't just a procedure. It was a delicate dance between his medical expertise and the deeply personal history he shared with the man on the operating table. James Whitman had been a father figure to Eleanor for years, but in an instant, he had turned his back on her and, by extension, on Malcolm. Malcolm entered the sterile operating room early the next day, greeted by the hum of machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses. As he scrubbed in, his thoughts kept returning to the bitter dinner 2 years ago, the harsh words from James that still echoed in his mind. "Consider yourself disowned." They were words Malcolm would never forget, yet he found himself here, about to save the life of the man who had broken Eleanor's heart. "Dr. Reed, we're all ready," one of the nurses said, her voice steady but kind. Malcolm nodded, his face a mask of professionalism. "Let's get to work." As the anesthesia took effect and James fell into a deep sleep, Malcolm's mind was focused on the procedure. There was no room for emotions now, only the steady, rhythmic beat of the task at hand. He was the best in his field, and no matter the personal stakes, he would give nothing less than perfection. But as his scalpel touched James's chest, a pang of something deeper stirred within him. This man, so proud, so unwavering in his principles, was now utterly vulnerable. And as the surgery unfolded, a strange shift occurred. Malcolm began to understand the complexity of James's life, the weight of his choices, and the armor he had built around himself. Was it all really just pride? Or had something more, something deeply ingrained, driven his actions? Hours passed and the bypass surgery progressed smoothly. As Malcolm closed the incision, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the two of them once this moment had passed. Would they be able to rebuild their fragile bridge, or was it already too late? The surgery was a success. Malcolm's hands had moved with precision, and the team had worked seamlessly to restore James's heart, both figuratively and literally. As the anesthesia wore off, James slowly stirred, his eyelids fluttering before he blinked against the harsh hospital lights. "Mr. Whitman?" Malcolm's voice broke through the haze of recovery. "You're in the recovery room. The surgery went well." James blinked again, his eyes clear, but clouded with a mix of exhaustion and wariness. He turned his head slowly, meeting Malcolm's gaze with a look that was hard to read. For a brief moment, the old arrogance flared in his eyes, but it was quickly subdued by something else, a flicker of gratitude, or perhaps something even deeper. Malcolm allowed a small professional smile to play on his lips. "You're going to be all right. Rest for now." James's lips parted, and for a moment, Malcolm thought he might say something dismissive. Instead, the words that left James's mouth were unexpectedly soft. "I'm sorry." Malcolm froze. The apology was quiet, but it hit like a thunderclap. He wasn't sure if James was apologizing for the years of bitterness toward him, for the cruel rejection of Eleanor, for something else entirely, but it didn't matter. Whatever the apology meant, it was a crack in the armor James had so carefully built around himself. "You've made your choice, Mr. Whitman," Malcolm replied gently, his eyes scanning the monitors to give James a moment to process. "But I don't want your apologies. I just want you to recover." There was silence between them, thick and uncomfortable. James looked away, clearly struggling with something unspoken, but eventually he nodded. "I owe you my life," James muttered. "Has won't forget this." Malcolm didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded once, then turned and walked toward the door. Outside the room, he paused. It wasn't closure, but it was a start. Malcolm couldn't deny that the situation was complicated. He'd saved a man who had once been his enemy, but there were no guarantees. Would James truly change? And if he did, could Malcolm and Eleanor ever find their way back to the family they'd been forced to leave behind? The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt as if he'd taken the first step toward healing. Days passed since the surgery, and James Whitman's recovery progressed well, but the tension in the hospital remained palpable. Malcolm visited him regularly, checking his progress, adjusting medications, and offering updates on his condition. The conversations between them were polite but clipped, as though neither man quite knew how to navigate the unfamiliar territory they now shared. James had always been a man of action, not words. His pride, once unshakable, had been fractured, and though he no longer wore his disdain for Malcolm so openly, there was still an unspoken divide between them. But beneath the tension, there was something else, a shift. James was no longer the arrogant patriarch sitting behind his desk in his mansion. He was vulnerable, human, and perhaps for the first time, aware of the toll his past actions had taken. One afternoon, as Malcolm was preparing to leave the room, James called out to him, "Dr. Reed." Malcolm paused, but didn't turn around right away. He had learned to listen for more than just the words, to pay attention to what wasn't being said. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to say, I regret what I did. What I said to Eleanor, it was unforgivable." James's voice wavered, as though the words were foreign to him. "I pushed her away, and I pushed you away too. I can't take that back, but I want to make things right." Malcolm turned to face him, his expression unreadable. It was the first time James had truly acknowledged the depth of the harm he'd caused, and the sincerity in his voice gave Malcolm pause. "You've hurt her deeply, Mr. Whitman," Malcolm replied, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And me too. But it's not just about what's said in the moment. It's about showing change. Making amends takes time." James lowered his gaze, his jaw tight with frustration. "I know that. I do. But I'm not sure how to fix it. Eleanor, she's everything to me. And I failed her." The room was heavy with his admission. There was no easy answer, no quick fix for the wounds that had been inflicted. But Malcolm saw something in James's eyes that had never been there before, an earnest desire to change. And though it was far from enough, it was a start. "We'll see," Malcolm said, offering a faint but genuine smile. "But the first step is being here, and you've done that." As he left the room, the door clicking softly behind him, Malcolm couldn't help but wonder if, in time, the rift between James and his daughter might begin to heal. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, the possibility of reconciliation seemed just within reach. The days turned into weeks, and James's recovery was steady, but Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that the true healing had just begun. Each visit to the hospital room felt like another small step in a fragile reconciliation. James's pride had been broken, but the walls around his heart were still high and thick, and Malcolm wasn't sure if they would ever come down entirely. Eleanor had visited her father only once since the surgery. Her presence had been tense, as expected. She walked into the room with her chin held high, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding his gaze. For a moment, Malcolm could feel the weight of her hurt, the deep scars her father's rejection had left on her. James, on the other hand, had barely spoken. There was too much between them, too much history of pain, resentment, and pride that neither of them could easily navigate. Still, it was a start. Eleanor had said nothing, but she had stayed longer than anyone expected. She had quietly listened as James apologized again, his voice low and uncertain. She hadn't forgiven him, not yet, but she hadn't walked away either. That was progress in its own right. Malcolm watched the two of them from the doorway, his heart heavy. He knew that true forgiveness couldn't be rushed. Time was the only thing that could heal the wounds of the past. But it was clear that both James and Eleanor needed more than time. They needed understanding, patience, and trust. Things that neither of them had ever been willing to give. After Eleanor left, James asked to speak with Malcolm. He looked smaller than before, the illness having drained him in ways that went beyond physical recovery. "I know she hasn't forgiven me, and I don't expect to," James said quietly. "But I can't stand the thought of losing her forever. How do I fix this?" Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question settle in. He had no easy answers, no quick solutions. He couldn't promise that everything would be fine, but he could offer this. "Be patient," Malcolm said. "Show her you're different, but don't rush it. Let her come to you in her own time. The only thing you can do now is show up, be consistent, and make sure she knows you're really trying." James nodded, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. There was no guarantee, but for the first time in a long while, there was a spark of hope in his eyes. The road ahead would be long, but James was willing to walk it, one step at a time. The months following James's surgery passed slowly, but with each passing day, the atmosphere in his home began to shift. The once towering mansion filled with expensive furniture and immaculate decor now seemed oddly quiet. The echoes of his past decisions still lingered in the halls, but there were moments, brief, fleeting ones, where something resembling peace seemed to settle over the place. James had taken to spending most of his time alone, reflecting. His work had always been his greatest source of pride, but now in the silence of his own home, he found that work didn't fill the void that had been left by his broken relationships. He hadn't seen Eleanor again after that first visit, but he continued to reach out, sending letters, offering apologies, and asking her to meet him. Each message was met with silence, each attempt at reconciliation a reminder of just how far he had pushed her away. One evening, as James sat in his study, staring out at the vast estate that had once been his symbol of success, his thoughts turned once again to Malcolm. The man who had saved his life now stood as a quiet reminder of how much he had lost and how much he had yet to regain. James had been a man of pride, and that pride had cost him the most important people in his life. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't erase the pain he had caused his daughter or the bitterness he had created in his heart. But he could try, and that at least was something. As if on cue, the phone rang, cutting through the silence. James picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he answered. "Mr. Whitman?" came the voice on the other end. "It's Malcolm Reed. I wanted to let you know that Eleanor's agreed to meet with you. She's willing to listen, why, but only if you're serious." James's heart skipped a beat. He swallowed hard, not sure if he was prepared for what this meeting might hold. But in that moment he knew that this was his last chance. "I'm serious," James replied, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. "I'll do whatever it takes." As he hung up the phone, a sense of determination settled over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His reckoning. And for the first time, James Whitman was ready to face the consequences of his past. The day of the meeting arrived, and James's nerves were nearly unbearable. He had been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready. His mind replayed the painful memories of their past, the harsh words, the scorned looks, the sense of betrayal he had seen in Eleanor's eyes when he turned his back on her. All of it weighed heavily on him as he stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to bend others to his will with charm or force. But with Eleanor, none of that had worked. None of his power or wealth had been able to bridge the chasm he had created between them. The doorbell rang, and James's heart raced. He wasn't ready, but he had no choice but to face this moment. His butler answered the door, and a moment later, Eleanor stepped into the foyer. She was dressed simply, but with an elegance that took James by surprise. She was still his daughter, still the woman he had once held so high, and yet in that moment, she seemed a stranger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unspoken words, with everything that had been left unsaid for so long. Eleanor's eyes were guarded, the walls she had built around herself still firmly in place. But there was a flicker of something beneath the surface, a quiet curiosity, perhaps, or a hint of longing that James wasn't sure how to interpret. Finally, it was she who broke the silence. "You wanted to see me," she said, her voice calm but laced with an undertone of skepticism. James took a deep breath, his throat tight. "Eleanor, I don't know where to start. I know I've hurt you. I know I've pushed you away in ways that I can never take back. But I'm here because I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did to you and to Malcolm." Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly, but it was enough for James to know that this was his chance, his last chance. "I can't change the past, but I want to try. If you'll let me, I want to be part of your life again." The silence stretched between them, thick with tension and years of unresolved pain. But as Eleanor looked at her father for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Now that you've seen what happens, I have to ask, was saving James the right choice, or was it a mistake? Could his past actions really be forgiven so easily, or does he deserve to face the consequences? What would you have done if you were in Malcolm's shoes?" Let's dive deeper into this together. Do you think one mistake can define a person forever, or can redemption really exist? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, The twists in this story aren't over yet. You won't want to miss what comes next, so hit that notification bell and let's continue the journey together.